All right. Hi, everyone. Well, welcome. Thanks for joining today's webinar, What OMB's Uniform Guidance Proposal Means for Research, presented by the AIP Federation. My name is Lyon, and I'm a senior specialist focused on policy and engagement here at AIP. Over the past few weeks, the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB's, proposed changes to uniform guidance has generated significant discussion across the research community. The proposal touches on a wide range of issues affecting federally funded research, and many researchers, institutions, and scientific societies are working to understand what is actually included in this rule and what it means in practice. Today, our goal is to help provide that context. We'll discuss what uniform guidance is, what OMB is proposing to change, what the potential implications may be for the research enterprise, and how you can engage in the public comment process. We'll also take plenty of breaks for audience questions with a dedicated Q&A at the end. Before we get started, a little bit about AIP, or the American Institute of Physics. We are both a federation of like-minded STEM organizations and an institute focused on advancing the understanding of the scientific enterprise through research and analysis in public policy, social science, demographic trends, and the historical context of our disciplines. Our goal is to empower our federation member organizations, thereby advancing, promoting, and serving the physical sciences for the benefit of humanity. Today, I'm very lucky to be joined by speakers representing both the Federation and Institute sides of AIP. First, I'll introduce Lindsay Milliken, AIP's first Associate Director of Public Policy Research and Analysis. In this role, she's working on making science policy more accessible and actionable for the physical sciences community. Her work has been published in the Washington Post, the Boston Herald, the Salt Lake Tribune, Inside Higher Ed, Scientific American, geez, Lindsay, this list is long, the Journal of Science and Policy Governance, the NYU Journal on Legislation and Public Policy, and the University of Chicago's Law Review Online. Next, we have Jacob Taylor, our senior editor for science policy with AIP's FYI Science Policy News. He previously served as the editorial manager for the for the Study of War. He is co-recipient for the 2018 Robert F. Kennedy Excellence in Journalism Award for his work on Homesick, a multimedia reporting project on asthma and ill health in Baltimore. And last but not least, we have Mark Elsasser, the Director of Public Affairs for the American Physical Society, overseeing the Society's government affairs and public engagement efforts. In his role, Mark guides these teams in their efforts to enable APS members to effectively engage with both policymakers and the general public to advance APS's mission. Prior to joining APS, Mark served as a Science and Technology Policy Fellow, supported by California Council on Science and Technology. So thanks for joining, everyone. Really quickly before we jump in, I do want to note that I will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the webinar, so please use the Zoom Q&A feature to submit questions as they come up. Thank you to those who submitted questions in advance. We'll be pausing throughout the program to answer questions that are related to the current topic of discussion. If we move on before your question is addressed, do not worry. We've reserved time at the end for audience Q&A, and we will do our best to get through as many questions as possible. The discussion will be recorded and sent out via email after the event. Okay, so enough of my rambling. Let's get going. Lindsay, I'm going to start with you today. Can you provide some context for our audience? Who are the players here? What is OMB and what exactly is uniform guidance?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. I just wanted to, just before I get into my spiel here, one of our attendees asked if closed captions could be enabled for this webinar. Is that possible?
I will work on that as you answer. Thank you.
Great. So let's start out with just the complete basics. The Office of Management and Budget is one of the biggest pieces of the Executive Office of the President. And it basically is the implementation and enforcement arm of presidential policy across the executive branch. It generally has 5 responsibilities: budget development and execution, which plays a big role in the appropriations cycle, oversight of agency performance and their finances, coordination of all significant regulations and the review of those regulations through the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA, which is something that some of you may have heard in this whole context of the proposed rule. They also review and clear all of agency communications with Congress to make sure that they are aligned with presidential priorities. And they also are in charge of delivering executive orders and presidential memoranda to the agency heads and other relevant officials. So that's basically what OMB does. And the uniform guidance is basically what we call 2 CFR 200. So this is the section of the Code of Federal Regulations that basically governs how federal funds can be managed and spent by non-federal entities. So, in other words, this basically means that if any organization receives federal money in a form of a grant, for example, these rules at 2 CFR 200 basically govern how that grant should be managed. It can be things like administrative requirements, uh, cost principles, which is a fancy term for saying like which money, what can federal money be spent on and what it can't be spent on, and also requirements for audits. It's called a uniform guidance because it actually in 2014 was a consolidation of 8 separate guidance documents that governed grants. And so basically, under the Obama administration, they wanted to streamline this process for grants management, not only for the federal government, but also for the grantees themselves. And so then they put it all under 2 CFR 200 or the uniform guidance. So when we talk about this proposed rule, it would significantly change the uniform guidance or essentially 2 CFR 200. It first, like I said, first went into effect at the end of 2014, but has experienced several major changes over the past few years, one of them being in 2020 and the last one being in 2024.
Awesome. Thank
Back
you
over
so
to
much
you.
for that, Lindsay. Next, Jacob and Mark, I'm going to come to you. Can you both talk a little bit more about what's in this proposed rule? What specific changes are we looking at? Jacob, I'll let you kick us off.
Sure, happy to. Uh, so there's a lot in this rule. One little bit of the history that I want to spell out here is that, a lot has been talked about with the idea that, the rule makes it so that political appointees will have a lot more authority over grant making decisions. That's been kind of the headline. And that's a little bit of old news because that stems from an executive order that Trump put out last year. So we kind of knew this was coming, but a lot of what you'll find in this rule, which is hundreds of pages, is that in delivering on a presidential order like that, you end up deploying a lot of other bits and pieces that serve what might be like a fairly simple sentence, even in an executive order, then has to become a lot more things in a rule like this. So, with that being said, there are provisions in here that would make it difficult, if not possibly impossible, to get funding if grantee is determined to be engaged in diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. There are also a lot of provisions relating to research security. You could also think of those as provisions that relate to international collaboration. Broadly speaking, it attempts to unify the lists of restrictions, which are currently pretty dispersed throughout the government. I'm sure we'll talk about this more in detail later on, but you have different agencies with different rules of who can collaborate with which countries and under what circumstances. And one of the things the rule attempts to do is unify all of that again into kind of a single system for assessing risk. And that also applies to the grantees themselves. So in addition to just how the rule would affect what kind of collaborations are acceptable. It also in assessing the associations that grantees have, it has a lot of provisions relating to that. And then bringing it back around to kind of that top line, there are changes to the merit review process. Now, in terms of the changes to the process itself, the shifts are fairly subtle. So, for example, it sets down what would be kind of uniform, at the risk of just being repetitive, uniform guidance for the role that merit review is supposed to play at various agencies that use merit review. It doesn't get rid of merit review, doesn't get rid of peer review or anything like that, but it establishes that everything there is advisory, which in general is kind of how things have been in the past regardless. But again, to not miss the forest for the trees, that consolidation is delivered in the context of how merit review informs the political appointees who have now a much larger role and a more overt role in grant making decisions. And that's through it creates a new requirement called a pre-issuance review, which I'm sure we will talk about more in the future. But that's essentially the stage of the merit review process for grants where the political appointee or whoever they delegated their authority to assesses a grant for a large number of criteria, including a number of things I've already talked about. And then the very last one I want to mention is there are provisions in there relating to indirect costs. It's actually kind of a confusing thing. The rule insists that it does not make changes to indirect costs, but it does, and they are subtle. So I can talk about that more in the like farther down in the webinar, but those are also in there. I'll hand it
Great.
over to Mark.
Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, I'll focus on one issue around professional activities, and then I might say something additional about merit review. So there are new guidelines, restrictions around professional activities. The proposed rule would impact a lot of activities that I think are really basic parts of being a scientist, right? That's going to conferences, that's giving talks, presentations, it's publishing papers in peer-reviewed journals. Another way to think about that is restrictions on disseminating somebody's own research results. So I'd say at a minimum, the rule would create new obstacles for scientists to navigate. But I think in some cases, some of the more egregious proposed changes, it would ban critical activities. And so I'll give a few examples. The new rule says things like grant funds can only be used to cover society membership dues with prior written approval from the funding agency. Another example, grant funds can only cover the cost of attending a conference if participating in the conference is expressly approved by the funding agency and it's included in the terms and conditions of the award. One more example, grant funds cannot be used to cover the costs of publishing journal articles. That's article processing charges, that's open access fees, or subscription costs. And that's whether it's direct costs or indirect costs. So those are three examples. And if I had to put it succinctly, right, it just simply makes it more difficult for scientists to be scientists. And on the merit review piece, Jacob's 100% correct. The proposed rule makes very clear, right, that merit review is supposed to continue and be part of the federal grant process. But I do want to highlight that the big change is this pre-issuance review, right? It's a totally new process. It's conducted by a senior political appointee or their designee. There's some really disturbing language where I think it specifically says that the appointee must independently review the awards. They're specifically told that they cannot just routinely defer to the recommendations of others, right? Recommendations within the peer review. They also have to make sure that the award aligns with federal law, fine, presidential priorities, and specific national criteria. And there's a particular line in there where it says the awards must, and I'm going to quote it, demonstrably advance the president's policy priorities. So I'll just say my understanding is that would give political appointees essentially a veto power, right, over any particular science or grant that may conflict with any administration's ideology.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark. Jacob, I want to come back to you really quickly. We're getting some questions about indirects. I know FY recently wrote an article about indirectly impacting indirects. So do you have a little more on that for our audience?
Yes, absolutely. So indirect costs, for those who don't know, often called just facilities and administrative costs. These are costs that that support research grants, but are not really for the research itself, to put it simply. And it's hard not to go into the history here. So indirect costs are covered for grants as a percentage of the grant, and each institution that applies for grants has a percentage that they are allowed to request up to for indirect cost reimbursement. And this covers all kinds of stuff, like common examples like HR, building maintenance, all these things that are kind of necessary for an institution to exist, which allows it to do research, but is not literally the lab work. The Trump administration tried in the past to cap those. They wanted to limit them to 15% flat. Some institutions have a rate reimbursement that is as high as 60%. And again, just to clarify the math here, that's on top of each dollar that they get for a research grant. So if you get, for $1 of research grant money, if you have an indirect cost rate of 60%, then you can request up to, and emphasis on up to, an additional 60 cents to administer that dollar of research funding. So they wanted to reduce that so it would be a maximum of 15 cents for everybody across the federal government, all grants, period. And they did this on like an agency by agency basis in the past, and it prompted lawsuits. Courts generally ruled against the administration on this. And so a lot of those caps were thrown out. And on top of that, Congress uh, basically also torpedoed it. They included language in the appropriations bills that blocked OMB from changing the rates from what had been negotiated in 2024. And they did that pretty consistently. And then that kind of killed the last of the court cases, and OMB supposedly kind of backed off of this. So, apologies for the windy path here, because that brings us to this rule, where you will find, if you look up indirect costs, I'll even bring it up right here. I know I'm not sharing my screen. But in consideration of this legislative and report language referring to what Congress did, OMB is not proposing updates to the indirect cost rate negotiation system through this document, which it is not allowed to do by law. That's passed. But the OMB says it may consider issuing a request for information on this topic in the future, and says, commenters should not submit comments on the indirect cost rate negotiation system in response to this document, ostensibly because they're not making any changes to that, and they say they don't intend to consider or respond to any comments to the final rule. So that really sets out, that's like in the front matter for this, setting out that they don't make changes to indirect costs. But buried farther down, and this is the thing that we pulled out in our article, what they do is they include as one of the many criteria that political appointees should be considering as they look at grants is that all things being equal, they should prioritize institutions with lower indirect cost rates. So that is essentially recommendation language. It doesn't set a hard limit or anything, but it does imply that if this system goes into effect, one of the things that a political appointee could point to essentially veto a grant, to borrow Mark's language, is that, this university had a very high rate, so sorry, we're not going with that grant. We're going to go with this other university that has a lower rate. And there's a little bit of an argument here, like how significant that will be kind of depends on a lot of factors that we can't really predict right now. There just isn't enough information. But it fairly transparently creates an incentive to have a lower rate as an institution. Maybe this won't play a role at all. Maybe no one will ever cite this as a reason for, vetoing a grant, but it is in there, and it's only in there to create an incentive to lower those rates. We don't really know what that mechanism would look like, but that is there. And then there are a few other subtle shifts. I know I've been talking for a while at this point, so you can check out our article on FYI if you'd like to learn more about that. But there are a few other little tweaks to allowable costs under the indirect cost system.
Great, thanks so much for that. Mark, we have a question about sort of the political appointee oversight of grants. Is there's some sort of discussion that this is retroactive? Is this true, and how does that work?
And so I don't know what the exact language says. It might be a piece that's open to interpretation, but whether the political oversight is retroactive or not, there is another piece of the rule where they make an adjustment to grants where they act more like contracts, where there's a ability to terminate them out of convenience, and so that means that an agency can suspend and terminate a grant at any time for any reason. So political appointee being retroactive or not, right? A new administration could come in and do what they would want, right, with any current grant. And my understanding from reading it as well is that the agency would not be required to provide a detailed analysis of why any particular grant was terminated.
Okay, thank you for that. So then kind of to the group, now that we're all on the same page, what makes this proposal so difficult to evaluate? There's been a lot of discussion around what it means in practice. Why is that? And Lindsay, we'll start with you, and then Jacob and Mark, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think one of the things that's really going to be complicated for this rule is that it does have a lot of moving pieces. And it's very clear within the proposed rule itself that each piece has severability from the other pieces. So basically, this is legal language to say that if at some point in the future, a piece of the rule is found to be illegal or a court strikes it down or something similar to that, all of the other pieces of the rule will continue to stand and stay in effect. So it would be extremely difficult, I believe, to really be able to knock down the whole rule in its entirety. But there are methods, I think, going forward that would be able to pick down, like take out pieces of the rule, but the severability clause is a really big one to consider.
And Mark and Jacob, do you have anything to add there?
Sure. Yeah, a big part of it is scale, first of all. It's an enormous document. And as Lindsay said, huge number of moving parts. One thing that we at FYI have found difficult in evaluating this document, and that's not unique to this document, is the way even a single piece relies on a lot of other unknowns and or even if it's technically not an unknown, it's something that's like technically knowable, what I will describe as not readily accessible information. So, for example, on the research security front, there are references to the types of international collaborations that would no longer be allowed. And that references a number of different lists of countries, but it does so in a rather oblique way. So, for example, here's a description. To protect the national security interests of the United States and to ensure consistent implementation of longstanding statutory restrictions, OMB proposes a change to prohibit the obligation or expenditure of federal funds to support certain foreign collaborations involving covered foreign countries or covered foreign entities. And then the lists farther down include a wide range of definitions for what those things are, which makes it difficult to assess whether this is, an expansion to a set number of countries that are covered by a very specific list that is maintained, for example, by DoD, and that's it. That's the list, period. The way it's written, it seems to open a lot of questions about how broad that will be. For example, it farther down mentions that, one definition for countries that would be excluded would be any country that's affected by U.S. sanctions. But that could include a huge number of countries. And it probably won't. I hesitate to make predictions, but it probably would not be used to shut down all collaboration in every respect. But there are European countries, that the United States has massive scientific collaborations with. And we also, in various places, have various export controls on technology, on certain, could be simple material goods, unrelated to anything super sciencey or researchy. And it's really not clear whether that would qualify. That would make that mean that country falls on the list.
Thanks. And Mark, do you have something to add?
Uh, just to say, I agree with both Lindsay and Jacob. The lacking of detail, right, makes it pretty hard to understand exactly, right, how some of these provisions will be implemented. But for sure, right, everything points to a consolidation of, right, authority, power, however you want to phrase it, right, to the Office of Management and Budget.
Yeah, and a question just came in that I think is pretty important in this context is that are there agency-specific considerations within this rule, or is it just it seems like a one size fits all? So, like the example this asker posed is like high risk, high impact funding for some agencies because they take a long-term view. Some are more operational in their nature. So how does that play out within this proposed regulation?
So I'll take a shot, and then maybe Lindsay can correct anything I might say incorrectly. But my understanding is with the uniform guidance, right, agencies have some flexibility to implement that guidance, how best fits their agency's mission, right, how they do business, etc. moving that from guidance to regulation means that it is in fact a one size fits all approach. And so the rules for Department of Energy will be the same as the rules for NSF, as the rules for NIH. Pick your favorite acronym.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There are lots of things that the OMB asks or tells the agencies to do in documents that are not binding as regulation, but that the agencies take very seriously. And in those situations, there is an expectation that they will carry out OMB's wishes, but then can tweak it slightly based on their own circumstances or what the agency thinks is most important that might not be quite addressed in a lot of detail within whatever OMB is asking them to do. But yes, because this is something where they're updating the regulation itself, that's something that there really is no flexibility for agencies to interpret it based on their own circumstances. So basically exactly what Mark is saying. And one part of this that makes this more challenging really is that the updated regulation is extremely detailed. So detailed, but then also not specific, if that makes any sense. So there are lots of things that the agencies would have to comply with that they have not had to in the past. But it's also vague enough that it kind of presents the administration as it gives them a little bit of a moving target. They're allowed to kind of stretch the interpretation of what they put in the regulation in ways that benefit them. So there's not going to be a lot of wiggle room for the agencies themselves, but I think based on, like what Jacob was saying before, that it increases a lot of flexibility for the administration itself to impose its own interpretations of the reg onto the agencies.
Great, thanks for that, Lindsay.
If I may, I'd
Great.
like to add
Yeah.
on there. This to me links back to the question about why this document is hard to assess.
Mhm.
One of the big effects that it has is that it applies standards in a more uniform way. So if you're trying to figure out the amount of change that this will cause at, say, a specific agency, maybe because you work there, maybe you're just interested in like, how will this affect the National Science Foundation, for example? The delta for a given statute, the amount of change that this has, that a given statute has for the National Science Foundation, just is going to vary a lot, and it's going to be different for different agencies. And to me, a good example of this is the guidance cites what's called the Wolf Amendment. Very simply speaking, this is the bit of language that prevents NASA from collaborating with China. It's long-standing guidance. It's like one of the big reasons China is not involved in the International Space Station and other stuff. It dates back quite a while, and it's just this standard. We don't want to, the US doesn't want to collaborate with China on rocketry and space technology. And it's pretty specific to NASA. The new rule talks about expanding the Wolf Amendment to be basically government wide. So if you're at NASA, at least that provision, it's not to say that's the only change in there for sure, but so that's not a huge change for NASA because that's been the case for a long, long time. But it would be brand new at other agencies. How new depends on what specific standards they already had. If you're at perhaps NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration, based on my rough understanding of the rules that apply to NNSA, probably not going to see an enormous change there. But it's probably a bigger change if you're, at the National Science Foundation, for example, and there was a government-wide Wolf Amendment now, would fundamentally change a lot of collaboration and work.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jacob. So we're going to go back to process really quick because Lindsay, we're getting a lot of questions about Congress, the courts. So, a lot of the community has been calling out for comments. Public comment period is now until July 13th. What happens when that comment period closes? Sort of what are the next steps when it comes to rulemaking?
That's a great question. And so there are a couple of different ways that this could possibly go. After the comment period, the agency is required by law to read all of the comments that have been submitted, and then basically what they will do is bucket them based on the specific complaints. And then if they get major complaints in certain areas or they're seeing trends, they will often respond to those, or they're required to respond to those when they issue the final rule and either explain why they're not taking those complaints, why they're not changing anything, or if they are changing something, what made them change their minds to edit the language. So the agency is required to go through this process. But there's no set time period for how long this can take. An agency could take, I don't think they ever have, but if they really wanted to, they could take a week to evaluate proposed comments, submitted public comments. Sometimes they can take 6 months, sometimes it can take a year. There really isn't like a timeline that's legally required by Congress for evaluating and then responding to these comments. So one option that could happen is the proposed, and this one is probably not super likely, is that the proposed rule could die on the vine, where essentially maybe they receive so much pushback, particularly from groups that they especially care about, more conservative groups or Republicans, that they decide they're just not going to issue a final rule. Now, that basically means that once the term of President Trump's term is done, then that rule is dead forever. And it doesn't prevent a future administration from bringing it back, but they would have to engage in the notice and comment rulemaking process again. So that's kind of one option. Second option is that they evaluate all the comments. They want to be able to have the rule go into effect by October 1st. See if that's actually going to happen or not. I kind of doubt it'll be that quick. But say they publish the final rule. Then there's a few more options that kind of open up for what could happen after that happens. So one of them is Congress can actually issue a joint resolution of disapproval. So this basically means that both the House and the Senate pass a resolution, which is not law, but it basically says we don't like this regulation. Here's the reasons why we don't like it. But then it has to go to the president to be signed, which is pretty unlikely in this situation. However, if for some reason the president signed it, then that means that the finalized rule is null and void, and that the rule won't happen. There's actually also a 60-day look back period for this option, where if the rule is issued with 60 days or less in the term for Congress, then the new session of Congress gets another 60 days to review the rule and then prepare and pass a joint resolution if they so choose. There could be lawsuits. Actually, for this rule in particular, there are absolutely going to be lawsuits. That's probably the most likely scenario. I can imagine lawsuits are being prepared right now, but they can't be filed until after the rule is finalized. So that would basically kick a lot of these issues into the court system, which can also take some unknown period of time. If it gets to the courts, when it gets to the courts, because this probably is the most likely, the court will probably either issue a stay of the rule, which means that it won't go into effect until after the court process has finished, or they won't issue a stay. So that means then that the rule is allowed to go forward while they do the court process. So that's kind of another branch in the decision tree we have here. Congress has another option where they can write and pass blocking language in a bill. So this would probably most likely happen in like the appropriations bill for some reason. So if Congress gets together and says, we really don't like this, but we don't think that the president's going to sign a joint resolution of disapproval, we're going to put some language in the appropriations bill to say that the administration can't do this, and in the hopes that all of the other provisions that have to be passed to fund the government outweigh this particular one and the president signs it into law. And because statute supersedes regulation, if blocking language is passed and signed into law, then that basically neutralizes whatever was finalized based on what the law says. There are a couple other options before the rule is finalized, so between comment period closing and when the rule is finalized, if the rule has not been published, and there's a new term, there's a new presidential term. The new president can withdraw that rule. So that means that basically they've decided that they will not go through with it and they will not issue a final rule. New administrations could also withdraw proposed rules. So this is something where maybe they haven't even really gotten to the comment period yet, and then a new administration can withdraw the rule. If the rule has been finalized and a new administration comes in, but for some reason it hasn't taken effect at that point, the new administration can delay or suspend the effective date of the rule. And then at that point, they can engage in notice and comment rulemaking to get rid of the rule. That's a lot of information and a lot of different possibilities that could happen once the comment period closes. I would say what's most likely to happen is the administration is going to have a good college try evaluating the comments so that they don't get a lawsuit where that argues that they didn't evaluate the comments properly, because they have been hit with those lawsuits in the past. And there will probably be subsequent lawsuits to try to knock down pieces of the rule, and they might be decided just in federal court. There's a chance it could go to the Supreme Court, but that is very hard to predict.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. That's really good context. Mark, I'm going to turn to you and sort of what are you hearing sort of from Congress about this? Do you know if there's general awareness? Kind of how can the scientific community engage on the congressional front?
So, at least at the beginning, let's say even a week ago, I think there was not much awareness, in particular with the majority in Congress. I can just say I was in some social settings with Hill staff where, in those settings, I try not to talk much about business, but it inevitably comes up. And so I said, "Oh yeah, have you seen this? What does your boss think about this?" This is from members who sit on certainly on authorizing committees, at least, right, of some of the science agencies, totally unaware of it. Other staff have been aware of it, but had not, right, necessarily gone through and thought about the details. So, we're out there, certainly, right? Professional government relations staff are out there doing education now. I've also seen, obviously, the popular media, mainstream media, right, is starting to pick up on this more, and so I'm sure it's making its way into folks' just general conversations. But in people who do know about it, or right from the get go, most of the responses, "Hey, listen, there's a comment period, right now for 45 days. Make sure you get in your comment, and then come talk to us, right, after the comment period ends." So it's an easy out, right, for staff right now to say there's a formal comment period. Let's let that go, and then we can go from there. Especially considering everything else, right, that's on a lot of their plates.
For that, Jacob, I'm going to turn to you now. So, rule goes through in this theoretical. What does this actually look like? You don't need to give us like bold predictions, but what could realistically occur? We have some comments from the audience around influences into the grant making process, perhaps outside of like those of the political appointees, but special interests. How can scientists sort of manage what to include or prepare when they do submit grants? How does this play out in reality?
Boy, I wish I could give you specifics. This is the kind of thing where I think it's really worth looking at the forest rather than the trees. Broadly speaking, my assessment of the rule is that it is best looked at as a large scale shift in how science is funded in the US. Specifically, the goal of the rule is to give the executive branch more authority over how money is spent. And I think that's a really important lens to look at. I don't think the Trump administration would even like push back on that assessment. That I think is actually kind of their core thesis. It's not a secret. Uh, the argument is that things are slow, things are not necessarily aligned with, they would argue like the national interest, but that interest being established by the president, by the White House, and whoever is in the White House should be able to influence those things more directly. What this rule does is codifies that authority in a way that would be much more, I'm not a lawyer, but would be much more defensible in court compared to some of the efforts we've seen over the past 18 months to exert more control over spending, especially in sciences, but also elsewhere, where, some of those efforts have been successful in the sense that they have, cut funds or closed offices or reallocated funds, but a lot of them have run aground on, for lack of a better word, technicalities that, the head of the agency that ordered this office closed did not have the authority to order that office closed, or the head of the agency wanted to cancel this grant. And no, turns out that that doesn't work because of contract language in the grant that doesn't allow for just a sort of unilateral cancellation. And what this does is, in my view, frees that up a lot more so that if a grant is canceled and the grantee or the university or whomever sues, the administration has much firmer footing to stand on with a court where they can say, no, look, they didn't pass the pre-issuance review. The Secretary of Energy or his designee found that it ran afoul of this entry, and a court, again, not a lawyer, but a court would be more likely to view, yeah, well, that's in the uniform guidance. There's no statute that overrides it, so that's what it does. Um, and so, in terms of what that would mean for scientists in the US and the scientific enterprise, again, I'm hesitant to offer really specific predictions, but I do think some elements are safe to assess. One is that the person in the White House and their administration would have a much bigger influence directly on what gets funded. So it won't be as much of an indirect kind of like the president pushes Congress on issues, Congress allocates money, the money goes to the agencies subtly distribute it. And there are little differences from administration to administration, but broadly, those are sort of slow moving, high inertia things. Instead, it will be much bigger shifts from administration to administration. And I personally would argue that will be true regardless of who takes office. So you'll have big shifts if you see like, a shift from a Republican to a Democrat or vice versa. But even within party, there are probably differences between how like, JD Vance or another leading Republican now would prioritize certain like what they would prioritize compared to the Trump administration as it exists right now. It would also potentially allow within an administration really rapid pivots, which I'm sure supporters of this would argue are good. Maybe there needs to be more flexibility in that regard, but it would also mean that that grants and priorities could be shifted very suddenly, and there wouldn't be a ton of recourse for people who are affected. So thinking about what a researcher would need to do in that environment, I mean, you know, you need to ensure that you have really strong footing in terms of what you're getting funded for and whether the support is there. Truthfully, I'm not, I haven't been a researcher myself. I don't know. So I don't know for sure how comfortable people are right now with their grant money or how they have been in the past on a personal level. But even then, I'm not sure what assurances the government could provide that you would receive that, like if you were given a 5-year grant, that that money would continue for 5 years, given that all contracts, all grants would have these severability, not severability and how Lindsay was talking about it, but like these, no longer advances agency priorities or no longer advances administration priorities that just be cut at any time. Yeah, so, and overall, I think it elevates the executive branch's role in grant decisions over um, any other entity.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask one last question and then we'll go fully to Q&A. And Mark, this one's for you. We're getting a lot of questions about the comments and so like kind of the engagement aspect for researchers. Some questions around, if you're commenting, should the focus be on science funding in general, federal grants in general? What kind of comments would resonate in this situation? So I'd love to hear your thoughts and kind of ways people can engage.
Yeah, so Let's just talk about what's going on right now, where we can direct people's time, energy, efforts right now, and that is in fact taking advantage of the public comment period. I think it was Lindsay mentioned, or I saw it in Q&A. It's only 45 days, and now I think we're down to 27 days or something like that remaining. So this is our first opportunity, right, in this process to have an impact. It's also a critical opportunity for us to take advantage of for a few reasons, and I'll just highlight them. I think they've been mentioned already. First, as Lindsay mentioned, OMB is required to review and respond to all substantive original comments. And substantive and original are key words there. If there are 1,000 comments submitted that are identical through some type of form letter campaign, that's not really going to be effective, right? That's an easy thing for OMB to respond to and react to. So what we are looking to do is really flood the zone with original comments that will force OMB to respond to them. And at a minimum, right, it can slow this entire process down, right? We can potentially drag it, I don't want to say to a halt, but maybe we can get close. The second reason for these type of comments is that well-reasoned, detailed comments help build the case for subsequent legal action. So we know if this goes final as currently written, there will be court challenges. There's no doubt about that. And these comments, right, can help in those cases. And so that's a big piece of encouragement. And so with those two things in mind, APS has actually gone ahead and we created a web portal and a tool to make it as easy as possible for members of the scientific community to submit their own original comment. And so I'm going to do my best here to provide a link in the chat, and that's a link directly to our web portal page. And so instead of asking any member of the community to write one single comment about everything that's problematic in this proposed rule, all at once, we've actually broken this up into 4 distinct sections that we think really impact members of the scientific community. So there's a section on grant review and the politicization of science. There's a section on international collaborations. There's a piece on professional activities and extracurricular affiliations. And then there's a section on broadening participation in workforce development. And so if you go to the webpage, you can get a really brief background on each one of those and the impacts that the proposed rule would have. And then you can click a button to ultimately, right, try to submit your comment. And what that will do is that will take you to another page and you can be guided by a series of questions specific to each section. You answer those questions, a few sentences, maybe each answer, and then the software takes those answers and builds your comment. You'll see at the end your full comment. There'll be some boilerplate in the beginning with the section numbers of what section you're talking about included, which is important. Your answers, and then a conclusion. And then if you hit submit, that routes it directly to regulations.gov. And so that routes it directly in. If you want to submit an anonymous comment, you can go to our website and we have directions for doing that as well. And then I'll just highlight maybe 2 pieces to think about when you're drafting the comment. The first is, in my opinion, details matter, right? The more specific you can be about impacts, about unintended consequences, maybe intended consequences in some cases, the stronger your comment's going to be. And then the second piece is, I know this is impacting so many of us, right? So many researchers, yourself, your lab, et cetera. And those personal impacts are important. But the other piece that's important to mention is how the policy actually harms U.S. science, right? How it hinders our development of the STEM workforce, how it will weaken, the U.S. in an international context, how it might damage the economy, jeopardize our national security. Making those bigger arguments, right, about how this policy will impact the country more generally, I think is important. And I'll just end by saying, maybe using a sports analogy, which I probably shouldn't do. But I think now is, in fact, the time to run up the score, for lack of a better phrase. But you don't run up the score again with form comments, right? You run up the score with personalized, compelling, original comments that ultimately will need to be responded to.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. And I'm going to just run through a few very like kind of detailed questions based on what you were talking about because I can see the chat. So an original comment is a comment like don't copy and paste your buddy's comment, even though they might be saying exactly what you want to say. It has to be original or else they will group those comments together and then they will just respond to it as one. The response does need to be restricted to, I think it is 5,000 words. If you would like to go over that, you do need to write that on your own and PDF it and upload it to regulations.gov.
It's 5,000 characters.
Characters, even
Characters.
less. Um, so you can write more than that. You just need to upload it to regulations.gov directly. If you are not an APS member, you are not a physicist, you aren't even a scientist, you can still use the portal. Mark, is that correct in me saying that?
Yes, and I should have mentioned, I think right now we have about 20 to 25 scientific and professional societies who've joined as official partners.
I kind of on the process and Lindsay, there's some questions about like what's keeping them from just shoving these all into like AI and shooting out responses in that way. I think AI is a pretty new tool. I don't know how it's been used in the rulemaking process. I don't know if you have any insight there.
It's a good question, and unfortunately, I don't really have a good answer for it. The actual process that an agency uses to understand or evaluate the comments submitted during a public comment period is pretty opaque. Each agency does it slightly differently, but again, like they don't explain how they do that. I can say it's possible that they would put comments into AI and hope that the program burps out a decent summary so that it's easier for them to respond to. However, that can also become a liability in a lawsuit. Um, so again, one of the big options for lawsuits here is arguing that they didn't properly evaluate the comments or didn't properly evaluate the costs and benefits of the rule. And if they're putting it through AI and they're not actually reading all of the comments like the law says they should, then it can open them up to having the entire analysis process be invalidated by the courts. And actually, if it's invalidated that way, I think that's one of the only ways that would actually kill the rule itself, the whole thing.
And when you say costs, I think some people are alluding to like costs that impact them as the researcher, just things with conferences or publishing, or just, even just like getting the grant, but also, someone here has a question about like how realistically could an agency go through a political appointee go through and, pre-approve every grant, right? Like, I that's probably a cost aspect if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely a cost aspect because, there is kind of like scientists are not able to, and not even just scientists, this impacts all grants that the federal government gives out. I mean, these people who are relying on these grants don't have all day or to sit around and like hope that the administration is going to have some poor guy like read their grant application and give them a decision. And I think part of that is kind of intentional on the administration's part, is they kind of want to be able to, like Jacob said, exert more control over the process, but then also be able to kind of gum up the works for programs that they don't like particularly. Um, it's we see it in the immigration system, trying to gum up processes that they think they don't agree with or they don't think are beneficial to the country. Um, and I could see a similar kind of tactic being engaged in here.
Yeah, and do you recommend, this is open to everyone, should we ask for the whole rule to be repealed or target specific kind of sections on it? How would I write a comment about a specific piece of the rule?
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead, Mark.
So at least on the APS platform, we break it up into sections, right, where somebody can be specific. My recommendation is to focus a comment on things where you have direct experiences, direct right impacts, direct story to tell. That's going to be right the most compelling comment you can leave. Um, and on the APS website, I should also say it's not that you have to pick one and only one, right? You can in fact leave comments on multiple sections. That's up to the user.
I would just like to add that it's really beneficial if the comments are as specific as possible and are citing specific parts of the rule. Because when you think about it from a legal standpoint, all these comments will be public. When you submit a comment through the regulations.gov database, it eventually pops up on the website for everyone to be able to read. And these are things that will be critical for lawyers to cite, saying, look at these, look, judge, these are these organizations that have really detailed the costs that this rule is going to have on them, whether they're not going to be able to have scientific conferences, and that's going to really decimate the tourism industry in this particular area, or really impact they're not going to be able to offer scholarships, so it's really going to impact their ability to support early career researchers. And the rule doesn't have anything about this level of cost. Like, it doesn't have anything about this in the proposed rule itself. So the government didn't do a good, obviously, because look at all these costs that people are talking about. The government didn't properly evaluate what the impact of the rule would be, and then the rule would have to go back to they'd have to basically go back to the drawing board. So thinking about it, I think, in a way where you really want to write a comment where a lawyer could look at it, and a lawyer that really doesn't have a lot of science experience or, experience with other technical fields, and say, like, this is bad. This is actually really bad. And here I can actually put this in my argument to a judge that says that this is going to be a really big deal that the government needs to pay attention to.
Thank you. And Mark, just out loud for the audience, are people allowed to submit more than one comment?
Yes. Yes.
There you go. Okay, so I'm going to go back to like one more kind of question about the rule. And Jake, I'm just calling on you, but you don't have to answer this. So there's some questions about the organization that is applying for a grant. So one, in terms of where the person is based or the organization is, like a research institute, an academic institution, a professional association. There's another sort of tangential question around sort of activities at an institution and how that affects their ability to get a grant or have their grant canceled. So this person gave like an example of like campus demonstrations. And if that could prompt OMB to decide that the university is violating something within the new uniform guidance. What do you know sort of about the institutional issues there?
Yes, I would love to answer that. Give me one moment because, as I said, it is an enormous document and I want to find the exact section I'd like to pull from. Mark or Lindsay, if either of you have anything you'd like to say on this, please go for it.
I can also just ask another question that Mark and Lindsay, I'm sure you could answer. So there's just a lot of concern here that basically what's happening here is they're saying that a grant could be canceled in real time. So the science just stops. There's no results. What happens to those? Like what's the implication there?
And to say yes, I think that is right. Unfortunately, a possibility, certainly, right, and it in certain in certain sub-disciplines or disciplines, right. I think if this rule was implemented as is, you would potentially see that.
Yeah, I would agree with Mark, and I think that there can be some pretty intense consequences, especially if it's an ongoing project or the project has samples that they need to sustain over a period of time. And if the funding runs out and they're not able to sustain those types of samples, then it might take them years to get back to where they were before the grant was canceled. So I think that there's definitely a chance that this could have some pretty significant impacts on science.
And so I will just flag that we are at time. If it's okay with my speakers, since we are recording this, we'll just go over and answer a few more questions. Don't worry guys, I won't keep you online until dinner, but I do think there are a few good ones that people would love some clarity on. Jacob, do you want me to go another question or are you ready to party?
Oh gosh, I wish. I cannot find the section that actually details.
We can
I'd
go to
like to be
another.
able to relate.
I have a question for Lindsay while you search that 400-page document. Lindsay, there's a question here about gold standard science, which for those who don't know, came from an executive order sort of around how scientific research should be conducted. Can you talk a little bit about how that plays into all this? And if it's not too out of the way, there was a question about like where did this rule come from? Who's the one cooking in the kitchen here? And I think these all kind of tie together.
Yeah, both very good questions. Gold standard science, as you all may know, is something that was introduced in an executive order that President Trump had issued, where the argument was to increase the reproducibility of science or but improve the quality of data. However, the way that they word it is very vague and in a way that is fairly easy for the administration to bend federal funding to go towards issues that they care the most about and away from issues that they disagree with. Um, so part how it plays into the proposed rule is that part of this pre-issuance review, one of the elements of that is this potential grantee adhering to the standards of gold standard science. There's actually an element in there where they can evaluate the past activities of that organization and if and that can factor into their potential to get a grant in the future. So if they didn't adhere to gold standard science in a previous federal grant, that could negatively impact them in being able to get a grant going forward. As to who's kind of the mastermind of this whole thing, I'm sure there are lots of hands in the pot here, but really, it ultimately comes down to Russ Vought, who is the head of the Office of Management and Budget. He's been very involved in the President Trump's first term. He was very involved in the campaigns. So he's been in the Trump machinery for a long time. He also has lots of connections with other conservative organizations. So I can definitely see as there is evidence that actually many proposed rules that have come out of the administration have been something that they've clearly been working on since the first term. So this can also, I can see this being something where they have been getting together for a while to kind of work out um, their grand plan for what they want scientific research, but also just federal granting in general to look like. So,
If we're
Jacob.
ready for me, I
Yeah, let's do
found what I
it.
was looking for. All right. So, Section 200.206. This is the federal agency review of risk posed by applicants. It covers a lot of stuff. But the kicker in there, going back to this question about like I believe it was specifically about the assessment of people's organizational ties. So, this is actually a great example of how this rule gives a lot of latitude to the people who would be making these decisions. So, for applicants, one of the things you would be assessed on going forward is this is item 7, history of questionable practices. Based on publicly available and verifiable information, the applicant's record of, and then there's A, B, C, D, and D, as yet, which is engaging in activities or initiatives that are inconsistent with religious liberty laws. You then have a subsection that, or a section right below that, that's memberships and affiliations. So based on publicly available and verifiable information, the applicant's membership in or affiliation with organizations engaged in activities that violate federal law, undermine public safety or national security, or advocate for the overthrow of the United States government. So there is, to my knowledge, no statutory definition of those criteria. So that's an example of where you have a lot of latitude. Now, I'm genuinely not sure, and especially in my role as a reporter, just analyzing these things as they come out, um, whether there are folks out there who are saying this could be used to reject grants because you went to a university that allows protesters to protest on certain issues without dispersing them, and it would be, that it would be at that level, very granular, very retaliatory. There are other folks who are saying, don't worry about this. They're talking about like if you are regularly in contact with known militant organizations. I will only say it does not spell anything out in that regard. It leaves a lot of decision making up to the people who are assessing the applicant. And again, to some of Lindsay's points, I th I think the thinking is that this would be this would come up in a court case. This would be, I was rejected for this grant because I had an affiliation with this organization. That was a violation of, you know, I pick a right that that's a violation of, that the person is going after. And then the administration would defend itself using this language. And then it would be up to a court to decide, actually, yeah, the administration is allowed to make that kind of a judgment call, or no, they went too broad and that's actually not defensible. That was a violation of the applicant's rights. Um, that's all to say, as far as the rule is written, it's really non-specific, and it does add at least a layer of looking at this because this is all in a section that defines what those pre-issuance reviews need to cover for giving out grants. So the idea is you don't have to reject people who fulfill certain specific criteria, but you do need to look at this if you're the person who's giving out the money.
Great. Thanks, Jacob. Okay, Mark, I'm going to throw last two questions to you and then we can wrap up. First one's a bit of an easy one. Your comment, sending it to your member of Congress, your thoughts there. The second one, I kind of wanted to, someone is asking about sort of, especially specific to the professional activities side of things. As scientists, you publish, you go to conferences. There's a lot of stakeholders there. There's equipment that needs to be bought. How are sort of, what does the coalition here look like? What are other groups that could potentially be impacted by this doing right now?
So great questions. So the first one, if you have the capability, right, to send your comment that you write to your both representative as well as your senators, so your full delegation, by all means, right, I would recommend doing so. And that could serve as an entry point for once the comment period is over, right, to follow up and say, hey, I submitted this comment. Now the comment period is over. I'd like to talk to you about what's next or what you might do. On the second piece, so APS is a scientific publisher. We do belong to a couple of publishing associations, and those groups are, in fact, right, also figuring out about replying to comments as professional or as organizations, etc. But there is also, right, a understanding of a larger group that's impacted, and so there was a sign-on letter that was asking for an extension, a 45-day extension to this, that was led by a few groups. I know AAAS, Research America, Institute for Progress, and I'm forgetting the others, led this letter, and ultimately 323 organizations signed on to it. I haven't read through all 323 names, but I am certain that extends well beyond, right, the typical set of scientific societies and higher ed associations. So the reach is large. I can also say I looked before this call, and so it's certainly more now. But I think there were more than 28,000 public comments that had been submitted thus far, and we're only 2 weeks in. So. And as I recall, oh, sorry, last thing I'll say,
Yeah.
and to compare that, I think I heard, and you'd have to fact check me on this, but I believe I heard in another call I was on when the Obama administration put out the uniform guidance, right, back in 2014, they did offer a public comment period. I think it was for 90 days. In any case, what I had heard was I think that uniform guidance received, roughly speaking, 2,000 or 3,000 comments. So you can see the difference that this proposed rule is getting.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my question. And we had another one come in about the extension. Correct me if I'm wrong. There was a different request for extension that was already rejected. Mark, I think the one you're specifically talking about, has there been a response there yet?
Not that I'm aware of, but everybody assumes that it will be rejected.
Okay, great. Wow. Thank you everyone for your comments. There are still a few we didn't get to. I'm really sorry about that, but we really appreciate the engagement. First I would like to thank Lindsay, Mark, Jacob for your insightful contributions. I've been talking to you for weeks and I still learn something every time. So, I learned a lot and I'm sure our audience really did too. A big special shout out to our audience. Thank you for joining. We really appreciate you taking the time to tune in this afternoon, learn more about this topic. I will be sending a post-event webinar email, probably tomorrow morning, to be honest. And this will include Mark's link. It'll include different advocacy portals from AIP member organizations. So, you might be a member of a scientific society that has set up a portal as well. We'll link out to all of those that we're aware of. And then Lindsay's also compiled a really fantastic list of additional resources. So, some of these are from lawyers or different professional society groups. We have sort of a section on other, areas where this impacts people like local governments, telecom, like anyone who receives a grant. And there's been analysis and studies coming out from those groups too. And for the audience, like a lot of people who might be impacted might not know about it. So, I think talking to your members, talking to the broader community, that's really how the word's going to get out. And I think the word's already out because almost 30K comments is a lot. In the email, I'll also include a copy of the recording. So we did record today, and you will get a copy of that. So I'll close out by saying thank you, everyone, for joining this AIP Federation webinar. It seems like this was a popular one, so we'll think about events we can host in the future. My email is llyon@aip.org. I think it's also in the registration. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any additional questions. I'm happy to connect you with people and additional AIP resources. So thanks, everyone, and have a good one.